Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to do block number 5 of the Sew Becca Sampler. Now, if you're not familiar with the Sew Becca Sampler, this is basically going to be a sampler quilt where I put together 12 blocks that will measure at 12.5 inches before we sew them into the quilt. And between those 12 blocks, some borders, and some sashing, we're going to have a nice size throw quilt. The whole idea of the Sew Becca Sampler is just to give you guys something to focus on while we're all stuck inside during all this COVID stuff. If you haven't done blocks 1 through 4, there's a playlist on my channel. You can go over and watch that playlist and get caught up, and don't worry, we'll wait for you right here. Honestly, you can sew any of the blocks together in any order, it doesn't matter, but there are 4 other blocks for you. The links for each of those blocks are in the description box below. So this is the block that we're going to do this month. It is called the Buttercup Block, and it looks kind of, to me, a little bit like a tulip, but I think it's supposed to be like a buttercup flower. You can see for this block that you're just going to need some background fabric and then 2 contrasting prints, one for your leaf and one for your flower bud. I actually did throw in a 3rd color, just a little bit different than the flower bud, just because I wanted this middle petal to poke out, but you could do the entire bud in one color if you wanted to. Are you guys ready to get sewing? Let's get right into it. All right, here we go. Time to get our book. For this block, we're going to follow pattern number 19 right here. The name of block number 5 is going to be called the Buttercup, and as you can see, it looks like a cute little flower. You're going to use your background fabric and then 1 print for your leaves and 1 print, maybe 2 if you want this little bud right in the middle to be a different color for the actual flower. For me, I'm just going to go with a color for the leaves and a color for the flower, and then my white for the background. Now, the cutting instructions are all listed here under the column for the 12-inch block, but this is a lot of information to take in, and I'm not really trusting some of the measurements that are in this table because it's a little flaky to me. I feel like when I use some of these measurements, I'm not getting the true measurement that I should be getting, and I don't know if that's just because the pattern's wrong or because my 1/4 inch is bigger than whoever designed this, but the measurements that I would suggest you cut, I'm going to put right here on the screen for you. Now that you know what you're measuring, let's just go ahead and start cutting our fabric. I'm going to work on my background, then my leaves, then my flower bud. But first, let's pick out the colors we're going to use for our flower. I know I want my leaves to be something green, so I'm just going to pull a pretty green. This looks like a good leaf color. And then for my flower, I was thinking maybe something yellow, but I don't want it to blend too much with the leaves. And I'm working kind of with just a lot of green here. I don't know if I want that, so I think I'm going to stray a little bit and go with this. These will be my prints for, let's see how I like that. Yeah, I think that's what I'm going to use for this flower. These are going to be the leaves, and this is going to be the actual flower petal. It looks a little yellow, right? This should work. So I've got my 2 prints and my background. Let's get cutting. Let's start off with our background fabric. All right, from our background fabric, I know we're going to be cutting a decent amount at about 4.5 inches. So I'm just going to cut a 4.5 inch strip right from my background. And then I can always reuse some of this for future blocks. There we go. And because this edge was not as clean as I would have liked it to be, I'm just going to take a second to clean it up. I changed my rotary blade. It's going through fabric like butter. Okay, now it wants us to cut 1 piece at 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. So I'm just going to pull this out so I only have 1 layer. And I'm going to turn it around so the selvage is on my left side because I'm right-handed. And I'm going to look for that 2.5 inch mark, but I'm going to make sure that it's coming to this side of my selvage. I'm going to cut. And then I'm going to turn it around and line up that cut edge on the 2.5 inch mark. I don't know what the heck my daughter's doing upstairs, but she's thumping around. Okay, there is my 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch piece. The next one I'm going to do is cut a 2.5 inch square. So I'm just going to take this fabric and cut another 2.5 inch strip right off of it. And then I'm going to square this up at 2.5 inches. So I'm just going to turn it to the side, line up a line in the bottom of the fabric, and my 2.5 inch on the side. So we've got that. I'm going to set that aside. Let's go to my pile. Then I'm going to cut another piece off of this. It's going to be a 4.5 inch square. There's one. And two. And then I am going to have to go back to my bigger piece of fabric because I could have cut that at 5 inches, but I didn't. I need a 5 inch square as well. So I'm just going to cut a 5 inch square right off of this. So I'm going to make sure to compensate for my selvage edge over here. 5 inches is inside a little bit. I'm just going to cut up and over. And then I'm going to clean this up using that right angle that I just made. It says for my 5 inch square to cut this on the diagonal once. So there we go. Now I have 4 triangles of my background. These are all the background pieces that we're going to need. All right, now it's going to be time to cut our pretty fabric. For our leaves, we're going to cut one 5 inch square and then cut it on the diagonal. Okay. Now, because I didn't press this before I cut it, I'm just going to go press this nice and flat. And now I'm just going to cut it once on the diagonal so I have those 2 triangles the pattern's looking for. There we go. And those are going to be our leaves. Oops. My daughter messed me up, y'all. So I am going to have to look for the edges where I cut my fabric so that I can clean this up. I did not trim it before I cut it on the diagonal. So I'm just going to use this corner down here because I know this was a nice clean 90-degree corner. And I'm going to scooch these 2 triangles nice together so it looks like I never cut it. And then I'm going to find the 5 inch on the left and the bottom of my ruler. And when I do that, this diagonal should go right on that piece of fabric that I cut. I'm just going to clean up on the left and on the top. And now these will be the 2 triangles that I need for my leaves. Okay, we're going to move on to the flower petal. Bloom, bud, something. And for this piece, we need one 4.5 inch square. So I'm just going to open it up. And I'm going to measure from down here, 4.5 inch square. And this is actually going to stay as a square, so I'm just going to iron it really quick. Whenever I cut my pieces, I always cut them, if I'm cutting a square, a little bit big, and then I trim them down to size, just to make sure I got just the right size. And I gotta find, when I do that, the corner where I cut, it gave me a perfect 90-degree so that I can trim the block up. There is my 4.5 inch square. And then lastly, we need
a 5-inch square that we're going to cut once on the diagonal. So we'll come back to this nice big piece, and I'm just going to measure slightly bigger than 5 inches, maybe like 5 1/4. And then I will trim it up afterwards, make sure there's no crease under my template. There we go. This piece probably measures about 5 1/2 inches. So what I'm going to do is trim it down to my 5 inches now. I lied. It measures about 5 1/4 by 5 1/2. But I have a perfect 90-degree right here, so I can just clean up the right and the top. And now I need to cut this on the diagonal. We actually need a little pop of color for the little poke of flower bud that comes out of the petals. So what I'm going to do is take this little scrap of a little bit darker yellow green piece, and I'm going to cut a 2 1/2 inch square, and this is going to be that square that I use. So the buds that kind of come around this are going to be lighter in color, and this is going to be darker. I think that's just going to look really neat. All right, we should be ready to sew this together. I'm going to sew this square first, and then my 4 squares that are just half square triangle blocks, and then I'll have all 12 of my squares that I'm going to sew together to make my buttercup. So let's start here. I'm going to need that 2 1/2 inch square that's going to go in the middle. I'm going to need my 2 1/2 inch background, and I'm going to need my rectangle. I'm going to sew my 2 1/2 inch squares together first, and then I'm going to sew this rectangle on top of them. Now, if I sew this with a scant 1/4 inch, everything should kind of come together nicely. I'm taking a moment to just kind of line up all of my edges to make sure everything lays nice. There we go. And we're going to sew. I'm going to finger press this to the print side, and then I'm going to sew this piece on top here. So we should have the little pop of color in the lower right of this block. If I sewed this with a good 1/4 inch, then my rectangle should be exactly the size as the 2 squares that I just sewed together. And now I'm going to finger press this towards the white, just because I already got a decent amount of seam down here and I want to reduce as much bulk as I can. So that's our first 4 1/2 inch square. Now we're going to take all of these triangle pieces that we have collected. We've got 2 for the leaves and 2 for the flower. And we are going to sew each of these to one of the background triangles that we have. They're all going to be sewn along this long edge, which, as you know from putting our previous blocks together, is a bias edge. So we just want to be very careful when we're sewing this. We want to let the machine do all of the work for us. I am using a walking foot this time, and that's really just because my walking foot was on from binding a quilt that I did. I just didn't bother to take it off, but it's not a bad idea to use a walking foot when you're piecing. You can use a walking foot for just piecing or quilting or whatever you want to do. Now my trick for this though is to move my needle as far over to the right as I can, because that's going to let me line up my edge of my fabric off of the feed dogs. And then I will put the fabric in,
and slowly stitch all the way down. That walking foot really helps grab the fabric from the top. The feed dogs grab the fabric from the bottom and glide it through. The walking foot grabs it from the top, and so what ends up happening is the fabric goes in a bit straighter than it would if you weren't using one. So if I did this correctly, if I sewed correctly, then I should have a 4.5-inch square, and it looks like, according to the measurement tape that I have right here, it is exactly 4.5 inches, so that is good. Now, the reason why I said I wanted to move the needle all the way over to the right is because that's going to let these little teeny tiny points go in just off of the feed dogs, which will keep these little teeny tiny points from going down inside of your feed dogs and your needle plate and then getting gummed up and all jammed up, and it just becomes a mess. So anytime I can move my needle over to the right, I find having my needle right aligned just makes my life a whole lot better. Nice and slow. Don't need to be Mario Andretti. Normally I am, but today I just want to sew nice and slowly. So my leaf fabric doesn't look like it's matching up, but we're going to sew this together anyway and see if we can make it work. I'm just going to use a very scant 1/4 inch. I know that this block needs to measure out at 4.5 inches in order for me to use it in my quilt top. So once I get these two triangles sewn together, I'm hoping that I just miscut my background. But I also know that this is the one that I cut weirdly and then had to go back and trim off, and it was a whole thing. So we're just gonna sew that with a very scant seam allowance and then see if we can get it trimmed up. See, that's what's worrying me, is this side is coming out perfect. So that one might be okay. We might have to come back and fix that one. Let's take a look at this first leaf, see what happens when we open it up. It's going to be off for sure. But is it bigger than I needed it to be? Yeah, it's a lot bigger. So I'm going to go back down with this. It was almost a 1/2 inch bigger. I think the white was just bigger than I expected. So I'm going to go back down and stitch this with a real 1/4 inch. This block is definitely going to need some cleaning up because the white is so much bigger. All right, let's go trim these blocks up, make sure they measure to 4.5 inches, and I'll come back and sew everything together. All right, let's square this one up first. I'm looking for the 4.5 inch line along the bottom and the left, making sure it's lined up with the fabric, and I've got a good 90 degrees here. And then I'm just going to run my rotary cutter along the side and the top, and if there's anything to catch, it'll catch it. If it catches nothing, then that's great too. That's perfect. Now we're going to go through squaring up all of our half square triangles. And the way that I do this is I lay my ruler on the half square triangle unit, and I look to make sure that my 45-degree line is right on that seam that's separating the background from the print. And I make sure that I've got fabric either touching or extending just past the 4.5 inch line for both of these, because that's what I want this to finish at. And I've got enough to go to at least the edge of the ruler or maybe even beyond. And I'm going to clean up the side and then the top. That'll give me a nice 90 degrees here. I'm going to flip it around and I'm going to repeat that whole process. I'm going to look for the seam here,
and clean up the side and the top. We're going to do that 3 more times. Find the diagonal, make sure it's nice and even. There we go. And we're going to clean up the side and then the top. Flip it around. Clean up the side and then the top. 2 more times. Find the diagonal. Oh yeah, this one's gonna be plenty big enough. I was worried it was gonna be too small. Now it's okay if you see like the bottom or the sides is going wobbly, because when we're done squaring this up according to this seam right here, it's gonna be perfectly squared. And the diagonal is going to go in the way we need it to go. Don't line it up according to your edges until you make a straight edge according to this 45-degree line. Now we're going to flip it around. Put that 45-degree line right on our seam. And when we do that, we should see the 4.5-inch line meeting here and here. We're going to make sure our little corner is coming down into the corner here on our ruler. Clean up the side. And then the top. Look at how perfect that looks. One more time. Turn it so the 45-degree line is on top of that seam. And make sure that I've got at least 4.5 inches all around. I do. You can see it's wobbly. It's taller here, that's fine. I just want to make sure that I'm pulling off some of the right and the top so that I can get a nice clean 90 degrees up here. Clean off the right and the top, pull it away. And now we're going to flip it around and use that 90-degree corner that we just made to trim up the rest of this block. Because we took the time to measure our pieces larger, sew them together, and then trim them down to the 4.5-inch size, we should find that when we sew all these together like a 9-patch, our block should measure much closer to 12.5 inches. Let's go back to the sewing machine and sew everything together. All right, so now it is time to put our block together, and the way we're going to do this is actually just assemble 3 rows of 3. So if we look up here, we're going to do the first row, the second row, and then the third row, and then we'll sew all of those rows together. We're going to start off with this little 4.5-inch square that we made that has that little teeny tiny piece of the bud poking out. Then we're going to do a half square triangle and then one of our background, and then we'll just kind of keep repeating. You'll see what I'm talking about when we get down here. So I know I'm going to need one of my backgrounds. I'm going to need this piece, and I'm going to need a half square triangle for the flower, which is this. So now I just need to make sure that I lay these out the right way. I need to set it up so that my flower petal is pointing towards the bud and the background is pointing up and away. So this is the right orientation for row 1. I'm going to take a seam, and row 1 will be done. And I'm actually going to press all of these to the right. So when I'm done sewing, I'll press the seam to the right. Did I say I'm going to press it to the right? I mean I'm going to press it to the left. Actually, you know what? No. All right, so I'm going to press it to the right. It doesn't matter whether I press it to the right or to the left. I'm still going to have some bulk here. What I could do actually, and I think I probably will try this, I'm going to press the top seams away from the center. So the top row is going to go away from the center. That way I'm reducing some of the bulk where these triangle points are. And if I wanted to look at the back, I can see the X where the triangle is made for when I sew these together so I don't lose my points. So I'm going to press out. I'm going to make the second row, which is going to be the other half square for the flower petal. And it is going to be the solid of the flower petal. And it is going to be a leaf. So we're going to organize it so that the flower petal points up and to the right, then our solid, and then our leaf, which is going to point down to the right. So this is how row 2 will look. Sew all of these with a scant 1/4 of an inch. Just stack my fabrics up nice. And then we're going to sew our leaf on. And if we're doing this correctly, the edge of our background should be touching that middle square, not the leaf. These I'm going to press towards the center seam, which works out well because I'm reducing bulks from these half square triangle units. And now the third and final row is going to be a background, a leaf, and then a background. And we just need to make sure that this leaf fabric is also pointing down and to the right. Scratch them together. And then these seams I'm going to press away from the middle just like I did on the top. And finger pressing for this should be just fine. Now we're going to take all 3 of our rows and we're just going to sew them together. So this is what our block will look like somewhat because I've got them kind of overlapping. We're going to take the first row, lay it on top of that middle row, and we're going to take our time to nest these seams. See how well we did, moment of truth. All right, not bad. If we lose some points in this, I'm not horribly upset by it, but that is what we've got. This does not look right, you guys. This does not look right. In fact, it's not right. I sewed the wrong side. So let's just take a minute to rip this seam. Just glide that seam ripper right on through. I know I sewed the right rows together. I just sewed them in the wrong orientation. That happens sometimes when we're not paying attention or we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. So I know that it needs to be like that. Yeah. All right, let's take our time to sew this together once more. Our seams should nest a little bit better. And I'm just going to sew. If I lose my point, I lose my point. I just want my block done. All right, 1/4 of an inch. There's no point here other than just nesting the seams. And then down here, the only triangle point that I have is the one that is laying on top. So I can just look at where the threads intersect on the back of the seam to make sure that I'm not losing my point on my flower petal. And then all the way off.
Now one more row. Make sure to sew it on the right way this time. It should go like this. You see, I almost did it wrong. Both of the petals should be facing down and to the right. So we're going to sew it on just like that. I probably will lose the point on one of these flowers, but again, finished is better than perfect, and I'm not going to stress about it. We're just going to sew it together. Sometimes a quilt is really about the memories I had making it too. It's not always about making it perfect. I don't mind looking at a block and seeing if there were mistakes in there because I see where maybe I was learning a new technique and I was still growing. Or maybe it just reminds me of a night where I was sewing too fast, or maybe just getting ahead of myself a little bit too much. Or maybe just frustrated and need to be done with it. All right, so there we go. This is our finished block, so we're going to take it and give it a really good press. And I'm actually going to take the time for this one because there's so much bulk right here where these two leaf half square triangle blocks meet. I'm actually going to press this seam open to reduce some of that bulk. And I think I'll probably end up pressing this seam just up, although maybe I'll press that one open as well. So I'm just going to take it, open it up, and run my finger nail along this entire seam. And then I'll do this one open as well, just for consistency. And all I got to do is go iron my block, and it's finished. That block went together a whole lot simpler than I thought it was going to be, and I'm quite pleased with the results. I'd love to see your block, so don't forget to join the Becca's Babes group on Facebook so that you can share your pictures with me. And then you can also share these on Instagram if you'd like as well with the hashtag Sew Becca Sampler. That's all I've got for this video. Hey, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. That's going to enable YouTube to tell you when I post block number 6. Thanks for sewing with me, and I'll see you guys all in my next video.